I think everyone is here, so I'll start by introducing myself and introducing our researchers. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aneta Hayes. I'm BISA's lead for research seminars. And BISA stands for British Education Studies Association, and we are an association that aims to promote debate about educational studies. And we do that mostly through our annual conference, through our journal publications, and also through seminars and webinars like this. Today's talk is based on a project that was funded by BISA to examine how program leaders perceive and view the current health and status of educational studies. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our speakers today and let them introduce themselves and their session as well.
Thank you, Annette. Great. Yes, we're really pleased to be here, pleased to present results from our BISA-funded project. We're going to introduce ourselves to start with. So I'm Mark Pulsford. I'm at the University of Warwick. I'm program leader of the Education Studies program there and director of undergraduate studies. Previously worked in a different institution as program leader as well, and that's probably enough about me. Becky, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, hi everyone. It's great to have you here. So my name's Becky Morris. I work with Mark in the Department of Education Studies at University of Warwick. And yeah, I contribute towards the undergraduate programme there. And I'm also really interested in kind of research around obviously education generally, but in terms of how education is studied in higher education institutions too.
Cool. Ross, hello.
Hello there, I'm Ross and I work at UCL Institute of Education, where I work in the music education team. And I came to this project through my existing links and friendship with Mark. We used to work together in another institution in education studies. And so we all have this shared link and kind of history in terms of our jobs with the education studies area.
Perfect, thank you. So just whilst we are on the sort of intro slide there, I wanted to note, and I think you would have all been sort of warned of this when you entered the room, that we are recording the presentation. So it's our intention to take questions and have a discussion with you all about the findings, and I think there's lots to discuss in there. And we're going to save that for the end of the formal presentation. So we'll record this presentation and then we'll stop the recording so that then your comments will remain, you know, just between these four walls, or whatever the equivalent is in the online world. Okay, so let's move on. So second slide, if you don't mind, Ross, thank you. So yeah, as Aneta has said, the project was funded by the BISA 2019-20 research grant, and it was back in May 2019 that the planning got underway, really. As we got to the stage of recruiting participants for the two stages of our data collection, we were supported by BISA in this through their newsletter, their website, social media accounts, and that's how we generated our sample primarily. And we wrote a few updates for the new section of their website, and that's a little screenshot, just if you need some proof that we did that. Our focus was on program leaders, their view of their role, their courses they run, and the future of undergraduate education programs. And today we're going to share some of those initial findings, and we've organised that around 5 main headlines. And we're going to present these findings for about half an hour or so, then open up for discussions as I've said. So I've got some background, and then we'll crack on with the data that Ross is going to begin presenting. So next slide, Ross, thank you very much. Yeah, so some background to get us going. So undergraduate education courses are popular, as you all know, popular choice for students. A couple of years ago, around 33,000 new students joined such a course, which is about 5% of the total number of new students. And it's about the same as computer science, about the same as languages. So we're kind of a mid-table sort of number, really. Undergraduate education courses are delivered, again, as you'll know, across many institutions, from further education all the way, all through the different types of HE provider as well. And that range was a key part of our study design, actually, that we hope to draw conclusions on, program leaders in FE, program leaders in HE, and make that comparison. And you'll see some of that as we get to the data. Undergraduate education is quite a broad church too, with varying degree titles, including, of course, education studies, professional studies in education, through to primary education with QTS and so on. And that means there's, of course, a lot of diversity in course content as well. And of course, that brings us to that key feature of undergraduate education, that it straddles the academic and the vocational notions of education. And so there is that varied relationship with initial teacher education, and so all sorts of progression routes for students too from that. And all of those themes we'll do touch on in our data and in our findings. And whilst there's a growing body of research and scholarship that explores the origins of undergraduate education, its interdisciplinary roots, of course, education studies itself is a 20-year-old program now. There's less about the doings and the delivery of these courses, and that's what our project aimed to focus on, really. So the next one, a little bit more before we get into the meat of it. So as we've said in our introductions, really, our experiences led us to sort of develop this program, and it's linked with our sort of personal strong commitments to these courses at undergraduate level. And it was our sense that greater understanding of where we're at will support where we're going next, really, and aid the evolution of the subject. And such understanding will be of interest, of course, to a wide range of stakeholders. So that's from BISA, obviously, all the way through to the many lecturers who work part-time hourly paid contracts on these programs. It's of relevance, where we're at and where we're going. A foundational idea of the project was that program leaders are a key group in this whole conversation. They're pivotal, really, in the way the subject is run, but also how it will develop in the future years. Program leaders see the challenges and the rewards sort of on the ground or in the trenches, perhaps, and can provide an important weather check on the health status and future of undergraduate education programs. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, a little bit about what we did, just quite quickly. So we had two stages of data collection. First was an online survey of program leaders of education undergraduate programs, but we also run a parallel survey with non-education program leaders to form a group against which we can make some comparisons, in particular about whether the challenges and rewards on education programs are unique to education or if they're sort of sector-wide. The survey ran from February to September, and most of the data was collected early on in that period. And we got 71 usable responses from education program leaders and 62 from non-education program leaders. Of course, a key point to make is that 2020 has been pretty difficult, hasn't it? So it's posed challenges for data collection. And of course, most importantly, it posed challenges for program leaders, no doubt. And so we had the industrial action from at the early part of the year, and then of course COVID. So, we need to note that we're sure to have captured some of those tensions and difficulties during this period in the survey data that we've got. We then conducted follow-up interviews in the summer and into the autumn as well, and we recruited for those from the survey primarily. And here we looked for a balance of education program leaders. So we've got 11 interviews spread across Russell Group, post-92, pre-92 and FE program leaders. Most of the focus today is going to be on the survey data, but we've got a bit from the interview findings as well to sort of flesh out some of that. So I think we've got one more from me before we get into the data, finally get into the data. Okay, a bit about the sample really. Primarily, we tried hard to get a spread across the nations, the home nations. Primarily, though, our sample is based in England, primarily as well, program leaders from post-92 institutions, I guess reflecting the base in those sorts of institutions for education studies especially. But we have got a group or some comparison groups of program leaders in FE settings and program leaders in pre-92 and Russell Group institutions. Just over half were female of the sample, and half of them are educated to doctorate level. So that's a little bit about the sample. Over to Ross.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the findings from the survey. And we've got sort of 5 headline messages really at the minute. Our first headline relates to how education program leaders came by their roles. We were surprised to discover that so many achieved their positions in ways other than straightforward internal or external application. Some 35% had actively applied, but a further 45% were either asked or told to do the role. And a further small number discovered that their role came as part of another job. Inevitably, a small number had come to the role in other ways, for instance, having originally developed the program or taken over in a temporary capacity, and this then leading implicitly to program leadership in the longer term. A quick comparison with our general non-education sample confirms that this pattern is not confined to education programs. In fact, in the case of our general sample, only 22% applied as an internal or external candidate, with 74% being asked or told to assume the program leader responsibility. In this sense, the proportion of education program leaders voluntarily electing to take on the role is somewhat higher than the general case. Our second headline finding relates to some of the prominent sector-wide initiatives or institutional priorities that impact on the work of program leaders. We generated a list of current higher education initiatives perceived as priorities according to Universities UK and Advance HE. And we asked participants to indicate the extent to which they agreed that their programs prioritised these. Now, in fact, there was quite a lot of agreement about how these priorities were regarded across program leaders from different types of institution. But in two cases, there were some statistically significant differences. Those working in pre-92 and Russell Group institutions were considerably less likely to agree that their programs had developed flexible learning opportunities, for instance, part-time or work-based programs. Those working in post-92 institutions were somewhat more neutral about this. And in contrast, those working in FE, however, regarded it as an important priority. And this links with other data that we have to suggest that FE student cohorts tend to include more mature students and more varied academic backgrounds. A related difference concerns the use of technology to maximise learning opportunities. And remember, as Mark said, this survey opened pre-COVID but closed several months into the pandemic. So there will be a range of responses relating to that issue here. And whilst all institution types were more positive about technology-enhanced learning, it was again a FE and to a less extent the post-92 institutions which had focused on this issue in particular. When we compare these findings with those from our survey of general non-education program leaders, we get very similar results. However, whilst the difference regarding flexible learning is replicated in the general survey, the technology difference is not. All categories of institution were equally positive that technology-enhanced learning was a priority. This may relate to the general prevalence of technology within schools and college education now, and could suggest that education programs with a particularly vocational focus towards classroom practice may prioritise technology within delivery. Our third headline finding is that many aspects of education program leaders' experiences appear to be shared across different areas of the sector. We asked program leaders to rate agreement and disagreement with a series of statements about their roles. Overall, they tended to agree that they had the support of their managers and colleagues on the course. They also felt that they had agency to propose and implement changes to their course and were generally positive about their leadership role. They did, however, note that their workload tended to be bigger than their colleagues. They had a more neutral view regarding feeling part of a community of either program leaders within their subject area or institution more generally. Overall, program leaders were less likely to agree that they had suitable administrative support, were part of a community of academic researchers, or that they were paid commensurately for the work that they did. Now, with regards to our general non-education comparison sample, there was a similar agreement in most areas, not least regarding pay and workload. However, there was one statistically significant difference, and this related to pre-92 and Russell Group program leaders being more likely to agree that they felt part of a community of academic researchers in the field than those working in post-92 and FE. That's interesting because our educational program leaders were, as a whole, less positive about this statement, irrespective of whether they worked in pre-92 or Russell Group institutions or not. This is an intriguing finding, perhaps indicating something important about the relationship between teaching and research in education departments, especially in more research-intensive institutions, and we're looking into this further. Next, we want to focus on a series of statistically significant correlations we identified between feelings feeling positive about programme leadership, and various other items in the questionnaire. These correlations differed quite a bit between the education programme leader sample and the non-education general sample, although there was some agreement with regards to the medium strength correlations shown here towards the top. To an extent, these differences in the general sample could be due to the very wide range of programmes and therefore programme leader experiences represented. It may be that those running undergraduate acting courses may have very different views on programme leadership from those running podiatry courses. And yes, both of those were included in our sample. So we'll need to come back to this general group and subdivide it further. However, those correlations at the medium level are of particular interest here. In the case of the education survey sample, we can see that positivity about the programme leadership role was associated most strongly in our study with perceptions of appropriate pay and feelings of agency with regards to their courses. Having the support of line managers was also associated by education programme leaders with a positive self-perception of their role. Interestingly, although pay did not correlate as highly for the non-education general programme leader sample, a sense of agency and managerial support still both did. I'll give you a moment to browse through some of the other significant correlations in this table. And although relatively weak in terms of statistical significance, it does seem that there is some kind of conceptual coherence here. And so it might be that we can undertake further work, perhaps through factor analysis or even through triangulation with the interview data to explore these relationships in a little more detail. Now, our next headline finding relates to how well our education programme leaders felt that their provision fitted within their hosting department or school or faculty. And our own professional experience suggested that there was a great variety in this regard. And so this variety was indeed represented in the data. However, some trends have emerged in regards to the types of organisational structure regarded as more synergistic. Within higher education-based programmes, many comments indicated closer alignment with social science or humanities structures. And in such cases, programme leaders often noted an aspiration to critique education through societal, philosophical, or in some cases, psychological lenses. Structures regarded as being more superficial, perhaps including things like broader life sciences department, where many different subjects brought together, were not seen as such a close fit. Within further education-based programmes, some education programmes found themselves bedfellows with various level 3 courses or access to higher education courses, which didn't always offer the most effective links. Though proactive links with social science or teacher education colleagues were still valued. I'm going to come back to links with initial teacher education in a moment. However, just to note at this point that with regards to institutions which also did have ITE provision, programme leaders most frequently identify closer synergies where there are clear progression routes with their programmes and teacher education. In university contexts, this tends to involve their graduates moving on to PGCE, but in FE contexts, this could be the other way round. So level 2 and level 3 non-QTS based teacher training programmes, bringing students forward onto the degree level programmes in those institutions. Now, we've identified a series of statistically significant, albeit relatively weak, correlations between the extent to which participants felt their programmes were a good fit in their department and various other questionnaire items. For those leading education programmes, there is, though, some evidence here that a perceived better fit within their department occurs in situations where they find themselves as part of communities of educators, feel that they have relevant support from administrators and colleagues, and their own feelings of positivity about the role and being part of communities of academic researchers also correlate to some extent, as did the size of the full-time permanent course team, with larger course teams correlating with a perceived better departmental fit. Again, there was a clear difference in this respect between our education programme leader survey and our general non-education survey. But again, this could be due to the very wide range of programmes being combined in the latter. And it might explain the somewhat contradictory correlation here between a perceived departmental fit and having less time to work on scholarly or research projects. And we'll need to explore that further. Now, coming back to teacher education links, post-92 and further education institutions tended to have a very similar profile in terms of teacher education. Around 70% of our education program leaders in these types of institutions said that teacher to education provision was based with them in the same department. Around 50% of program leaders in pre-92 and Russell Group institutions said that they shared their coverage with ITE colleagues, but a greater proportion, around 30%, said that they had no formal links with ITE provision in their universities. By contrast, only 10% of post-92 and FE colleagues lacked these links. A small number of institutions in each category maintained links with their ITE colleagues who were based elsewhere in the organisation. In general, where education programme leaders did have links with their ITE colleagues, these were mainly in the form of shared resources and shared staff. Now, in another area of the survey, we'd asked education programme leaders how closely they felt their curricula reflected the traditional 4 pillars of education studies. So that's sociology, psychology, philosophy, and the history of education. We were interested to discover a statistically significant difference in these responses when they were broken down by teacher education links. Specifically, in situations where programme leaders did not have links with ITE colleagues, they tended to report that their programs had higher congruence with these traditional education studies pillars. In situations where program leaders did have links with ITE provision, their undergraduate provision was more likely to have diversified away from these pillars. We think that there are connections here with feelings of close fit with social science and humanities departments, and we'll be triangulating these carefully with relevant qualitative data from our interviews. Now we're going to start to turn our attention to the qualitative data analysis now. Before Becky covers our next headline theme, I wanted to share this Wordle with you. We asked programme leaders to each provide 4 words or phrases which best describe their programmes, and here are the results. Obviously, far finer grained qualitative analysis is needed, and we need to carefully compare the language used here with our responses to the general non-education survey as well. However, you can see that supportive, challenging, inclusive, academic, broad, interesting, critical, flexible, diverse, political, multi and interdisciplinary, stimulating and accessible all appeared several times. And we are particularly intrigued by challenging because we need to understand whether this refers to challenging students with new and powerful ideas, or whether the course is challenging in some way, or whether it's challenging to manage perhaps. Cross-referencing responses with other qualitative survey fields and interview data will help in this respect. And over to Becky now, and then to Mark for some more on our qualitative analysis so far.
Great. Thanks, Ross. So what I thought would be useful to do is to just briefly summarise some of the information that we've gathered from the open questions within our survey. So we included a couple of open questions where programme leaders were invited to share, more in-depth views or experiences having worked on their programme in their organisation. And we've got some really kind of interesting initial findings here. These are certainly going to be useful to kind of flesh out some of the previous survey data that Ross has just talked about, and also to kind of exemplify some of the issues and themes and ideas that are coming through from that. But also we're going to do a little bit more work in terms of linking these with the interview data, which Mark will speak briefly about as well. So I'm just going to kind of run through these 4 main sort of emerging themes to start with, and then we'll just look at a couple of quotations which I think nicely exemplify some of the ideas coming out here. The first thing that was kind of running through many of the comments within the open survey questions was this idea of identity and purpose. And this alludes to some of the background comments that Mark was making at the beginning about, the emergence of education studies as a subject, what it is, what it stands for, and its role within universities and perhaps wider society as well. There was a sense from some of our programme leaders that education and education studies was a real force for good, was the phrase that one programme leader used, and the sense that it brought something very significant to the students who were studying the subject, but also that was likely to have positive knock-on effects into wider society. Not just through the employment that students go on to, but also perhaps through the values and views that they are discovering and exploring through the course as well. Linked to this and to some of the other aspects that have been emerging is this really interesting tension between the academic sides of education studies and the vocational sides too. This is something that we kind of were interested in from the outset of this project, and something that all three of us have talked about in quite a lot of detail. But it's certainly, there's links there with kind of questions and tensions with teacher education. Is education studies simply preparation for teacher education? Some program leaders were talking about that and challenging that viewpoint, but also saying that there were real issues with trying to get wider colleagues and perhaps the university to see that as well. So querying what the subject was for and its place within the university was important. Employability was a key issue here as well, and very much this sense of preparing students for something beyond university, and that was seen in a really positive light from the questions that we had, that the program leaders felt that was something that they were expected and wanted to do, that they wanted to prepare students well for employment, but that could include teaching, but also it could include a whole range of other potential careers as well. And as I noted, the kind of wider university status was important here. A number of program leaders commented that perhaps they felt education studies wasn't always viewed in the same way as perhaps some of the more traditional curriculum subjects, and that sometimes it was a bit of a battle to be recognised for the subject that they were offering and the content of that and the opportunities that they were providing for their students as well. The second main theme that we've kind of come across is this idea of uncertainty, and that emerged, I think perhaps partly due to the time that we were carrying out this research, but there was something also sort of beyond that. Actually, few of the comments really related to the pandemic. It was more about the sort of changing landscape of higher education, and many program leaders, particularly those who'd perhaps been in post for a little while, were able to comment in some detail about how things had changed in recent years. Marketisation was a key theme there, and there were a number of comments around competition and accountability, the challenges that this brought in terms of recruitment, implementing the programme, staffing, etc. as well. There were a few comments linked to this, but also around the sort of broader education changes that we've seen in this country, policy and practice, and thinking about how those had influenced the programme and what the programme was for. As I said above, some comments kind of explored this idea of the role of the programme within the institution, and was it linked to other programmes? Was that a kind of way to develop and improve sustainability of the programme and what it's offering? And the final bullet point there, which I think has been partially cut off, was about this idea of universities always feeling like change happen and that innovation is important, but a couple of the programme leaders were saying, but what is it that we need to change, and how should that happen? And that there isn't always that kind of clarity around that on a kind of strategic level. The third theme emerging, again, these are sort of very much intertwined, and I can see links between these which we need to explore and clarify a little further. But the programme leaders overwhelmingly felt a commitment to serving certain groups of students. Some kind of describe these as different groups of students to those perhaps who we traditionally find in universities. And there was a sense that education studies was really, really important for providing opportunities both for academic study, but also for future employment to some of these perhaps less traditional groups. It was also clear that these students helped provide an identity for the course. And so often we saw comments about how the course was linked to the experiences or backgrounds of some of these students, or how it was designed to very much support them as well. And this was overwhelmingly framed in a very positive light. The programme leaders felt that this was part of their role and something that they were very committed to and wanted to have more time on, actually, to kind of develop further. Linked to the kind of recruitment issues, it was also clear that these students were important for course survival. So a number of our programme leaders talked about how these students, there were a number of them, and they were very, very important for ensuring that the course could carry on. Finally, we thought about this issue of programme leadership specifically, and a number of programme leaders commented on the huge number of challenges and tensions that they face on a kind of daily basis in relation to their role, and how, you know, they were leading the programme, but whilst, you know, there was a certain degree of autonomy within that, they didn't always feel like they were in charge, and they didn't always feel like they had the power to make the decisions that they really wanted to, and that they felt could be really positive for the course, their staff or their students. As we mentioned earlier, there were some discussions about pay and time available for programme leadership. There was a sense that there was not enough of either of those in order to kind of carry out the role in the best way that they felt they could. Certainly time came through really significantly there, and you know, and I think that's something that is certainly worthy of further discussion. And I can't see what the final bullet point is there, and I can't remember what it, I do remember. The final bullet point was a really positive one, where although programme leaders were saying how challenging the role was, particularly in the last year, there was a real sense of pride that their course was incredibly important and valuable, and that generally they had, you know, a good staff and a really great group of students to work with. Thanks, Ross. Yeah, and then, I mean, I won't read these quotations out to you, but here I've just sort of chosen some of the key quotations which have kind of stimulated our thinking around these themes. As I said, the identity and purpose one, questions around what the course is for, who is it for, and what are we trying to do with it, really, and the extent to which education studies is seen as a sustainable subject in future years. And there was variation there from the programme leaders we spoke to in terms of their views on that. Uncertainty, as I said, didn't necessarily revolve around the current situation, but a more kind of longer term question around where universities are going, the direction of university study, and what that means. The third one around serving particular groups of students and this commitment to inclusion. So there were comments about lots of different groups of students, but there was sort of recurring ideas here around students who perhaps weren't as academically strong as in some other courses that the same universities were running, but there was a feeling that the programme could accommodate them and really promote their success. And then finally, I wanted to kind of finish on a high, and I thought this quotation was really nice, how this programme leader sort of shares the view of a number of others within our study, and that feeling of pride from the programme and from the students that they work with, and that they, you know, they really want to keep on fighting the good fights and keeping going with it. So I thought that was a nice way to end. Thanks, Ross. Over to Mark, possibly, I think.
Thank you, Becky. Thanks very much. I keep getting the message saying my internet connection is unstable, and that seems, you know, we have to have one moment in the presentation where we mention internet connections, because it wouldn't be an online session if we didn't have to mention that. Yeah, so sorry if I go a little bit kind of sketchy. It's the internet, I promise. So the final couple of slides, and probably 5 minutes or so, just to go through these couple of slides, where I'm bringing out some of the themes from the qualitative interviews we conducted, and picking up on lots of the themes, particularly from, as Becky's just mentioned, about identity and purpose, I suppose. So I've kind of briefly summarised some of those interview findings in terms of the challenges, especially, and condensing them into two main and related themes. So first of all is programme identity, and the second is programme leader identity. And sort of framing them as challenges, I think will be a good spur for our discussion after the presentation. So that's coming next. So firstly, programme identity. As the interviewee quoted here says, it's this constant battle of being in identity crisis. And, you know, this is such a familiar topic for all of us, no doubt, that it's almost hardly worth stating. But it was a consistent and really strong message. One of the key challenges for being a programme leader in education studies, key thing that consistently comes out. And of course, it's in the survey too, as Becky's just highlighted. So we need to kind of explore that and sort of centre it really. So first here is this understanding that prospective and even actually current students have of what the course is and what it's for. And that dovetails with those concerns around employability and that the sort of growing discourse in higher education. Of course, education programs have such an obvious link with careers in teaching that this idea can kind of supersede, or it's felt that it can supersede other messages that we want to communicate about what the program's for, what it's about, and what it could lead to. The other part of this issue is that within program leaders' wider institutions, they note that people don't really know what education studies really is. And this is all sorts of assumptions about what's being taught, what sort of staffing arrangements there are, what sort of students are on the program. And that's important because program leaders are talking about how that's seen as sort of either a barrier to being a kind of a fully fledged undergraduate program in some of their institutions, especially the more traditional places, research intensive places. Or on the other hand, it bars the way to being anything but vocational in institutions with a more practice-based or applied focus. And the final point there, key, and this is really one of the most frustrating issues for the interviewees actually, is when there's a lack of understanding about the programme from within their own department. And that in particular was particularly acute, it seems, as an issue within departments that have initial teacher education programmes, as well as these undergraduate education courses. And I'll pick up on that in a was talking about it, and I'll pick up again in a moment on the next slide. And so, yeah, that point really makes the link between this main theme, or the first theme and challenge, and the next, which is about program leader identity. And that's this idea of fit, going back to what Ross was talking about. So where does the program fit? Where's it best aligned? And then how does the program leader role fit within the structures of the institution and department so that program leaders can best address the challenges of making it work? Okay, and then that takes us into this second slide. So yeah, second theme or second challenge we're touching on is the issues program leaders face, of course, not just in undergraduate education programs, but it's a sector-wide issue. The key idea here is that it's felt to be a high level of responsibility or accountability that the role seems to attract, but often without the recognition or often the means to deliver on what the institutions or the program requires. The program leaders felt that there's often a lack of clarity about the scope and the reach of the role. So what is and what isn't in their remit. That relates to the issue of higher knowledge as a career progression step. It can also feel quite career limiting. The program leaders were talking about they kind of can feel a little bit stuck sometimes. So issues there, it can tend to reduce the breadth of what program leaders can be involved in, such as research projects, because the role can be all encompassing. It's also hard to know what constitutes good performance. It's kind of another issue that people were talking about when it comes to things like annual reviews or promotion consideration, because the role is necessarily about the bigger picture. And because of this, it feels much harder to evidence sort of personal impact, unless with reference to metrics that program leaders we spoke to they often find anathema, such as the NSS or income generated from growing admission numbers. That was a bit of a bit of dissonance, a bit of conflict there for program leaders. One of the main challenges here was that feeling of precarity, though, that there is this strain, and that's what the program leader I've quoted on this slide says, comes from having to persuade and cajole colleagues without management responsibility in the name of this kind of bigger picture for the good of the program. And that involves a considerable amount of emotional labor. Importantly, without the safety net if things don't go wrong, which it sort of adds to the stress there, I suppose, that if leaders were talking about how those pressures don't often feel shared with more senior colleagues. And that's of course all much harder when those senior colleagues, you feel that they don't really know what the program is, what its aims are, what you're all about. So that's this connect identity. I think that's a kind of an important one to explore even further than we have today. So the final point there is that the program leaders we spoke to all have ambitions to research more, to be involved in more scholarly activity, and this is often kind of feels like it's scuppered by having no time and having too much other work to do. But I think, and that's a kind of tried and tested way of explaining the issues there, the barriers there. But actually what the program leaders were talking about is that often it can come down to colleagues' perceptions of the program leader's role. And that's seen as a barrier to, for example, being invited to get involved in research projects. And that picks up on this avenue of exploration that Ross mentioned earlier about whether the teaching and research divide is perhaps more acute in education than in other subjects. And that's certainly kind of an area we want to spend some time examining a bit further. So that takes us to the end of the presentation, the data presentation, and we just have a kind of a final rounding up slide and just sort of where we're going next, and then we'll open up for discussion. So what we're doing next. So we're going to continue that analysis. So we've already kind of highlighted some of the things we want to explore further and we need to go further with. So we'll keep doing that, and then we will aim to write for publication around those. We hope to be able to do, present some of those kind of more advanced findings at a BISA conference in some bright future. We might be able to attend. We think this much as well, so those ideas are kind of irons in the fire. One thing that seemed to come out from the interviews and seemed to come out from our kind of other conversations was this idea of a program leaders network, that it can sometimes feel a little bit lonely being a program leader, as the only program leader, especially in departments perhaps where you don't feel like you are aligned or fit perhaps. So those are, that's been scuppered to some extent this year as lots of things have. So when we have the chance, we'll pick up on that and hopefully be able to begin to form some sort of network. And the final thing I wanted to talk to you about and share with you is a call for chapter proposals for a book that the three of us are going to edit. We think it's a really good idea. We hope you think it's a good idea too. We hope you write some great chapters for it. We've approached the Routledge Education Studies series and they're keen on it in principle. So we're going to gather some chapters, some chapter proposals, and put a fuller proposal to Routledge.